George Harrison's All Things Must Pass is considered to be the most critically acclaimed, the best-selling, and the highest-charting Beatles solo album of all time. It sold 7 million copies in the United States alone, an additional 100,000 in the UK and 50,000 in Canada, and it chalked up a Grammy nomination for Album of the Year in 1971. As Beatles solo albums go, I have a hard time not putting this one right at the top or near the top. And I struggle with that because I think this album is bloated beyond belief. And I think that George's underdog status coming out of the breakup of the Beatles colored the opinions of fans and critics alike. And I think that's why it's perceived the way it is today. And it may be a little bit overrated. Although I still think it's great, I think there are some big problems with this album. And I think that, coming out of the Beatles breakup, we were all rooting for George. We all wanted him to succeed, and he did succeed. But I think that the praise lavished on him is a little bit excessive. So here's the album, the box set with 3 discs inside. We'll look at that in a bit. But let's start looking at some of the reviews that came out during the time this album was released. And across the board, it was almost all positive. So I want to start with Ben Gerson of Rolling Stone, who said, "Both an intensely personal statement and a grandiose gesture, a triumph over artistic modesty, an extravaganza of piety and sacrifice of joy, whose sheer magnitude and ambition may dub it the war and peace of rock and roll." Oh, high praise indeed. Melody Makers Richard Williams, "All Things Must Pass, the rock equivalent of the shock felt by the pre-war moviegoers when Garble first opened her mouth in a talkie. Garble talks, Harrison is free." Oh, very dramatic. William Bender of Time Magazine, "An expressive, classically executed personal statement, one of the outstanding rock albums in years." Don Heckman of the New York Times, "If anyone had any doubts that George Harrison was a major talent, they can relax. This is a release that should not be missed." Tom Zito of the Washington Post, he predicted that it would influence the discourse on the real genius behind the Beatles. Ooh, Tom, strong words. Nicholas Schaffner of The Beatles Forever in 1977 praised the album as, quote, "the crowning glory of Harrison's and Spector's careers," and highlighted All Things Must Pass and Beware of Darkness as 2 of the most eloquent songs, musically as well as lyrically. Now here are a couple contemporary reviews that were a little bit more negative. Roy Carr, Tony Tyler were lukewarm in their assessment, criticizing the homogeneity of the production and the lugubriousness nature of Harrison's composing. Village Voice critic Robert Christgau was characterized by overblown fatuity and uninteresting music. So it was released again on CD. It was released a couple times on CD, but this was the 2001 re-release. It had some bonus tracks, and it was a bit of a special release, so it again came under reviews, and here's some of the retrospective reviews on the 2001 release. Q Magazine considers it to be an exemplary fusion of rock and religion, as well as, quote, "the single most satisfying collection of any solo Beatle." Mojo, John Harris, "the inaugural solo album that still stands as the best Beatles solo record." So you can see these are, some, let's see, 2001, they'd be 30 years on. They're calling it the best solo record after a lot, 30 years. 2001, Chicago Tribune, Greg Kot, "Neither Lennon nor McCartney, let alone Ringo Starr, ever put out a solo album more accomplished than All Things Must Pass. In subsequent years, Lennon and McCartney would strive mightily to scale the same heights as All Things Must Pass, with solo works such as Imagine and Band on the Run, but they would never top it." Nigel Williamson of Uncut said that the album includes some of Harrison's best songs, in My Sweet Lord, All Things Must Pass, and Beware of Darkness, and stands as George's finest and arguably the best post-Beatles solo album of them all. The Guardian, 1999, "All Things Must Pass, the best, mellowest, and most sophisticated of all the Beatles' solo efforts." George Harrison confronted the breakup head-on with the graceful, philosophical All Things Must Pass. It is arguably the most fully realized solo statement from any of the Beatles. And finally, Michael Gilmore of Rolling Stone in 2002 labeled the album as the finest solo work of any ex-Beatle ever produced. So you see how the glowingness of the reviews got even more glowing as time went on. And I wonder if these writers would say the same thing about some of McCartney or Lennon's albums if they were reviewed during 2001 as well. I don't know. But again, this was re-released in 2001, 2010, 2014, and then a big, huge box set in 2020. So the praise of this album has become like an accepted dogma, and it's rarely criticized. But I think if you look at it a bit more closely, it does have quite a few kinks in its armor. And we'll look at that in a little bit, but I want to talk about the music first, because that's really what this album is all about. All right, let's start talking about the lead single, My Sweet Lord. The biggest solo Beatles single of all time. It beat out My Love, Band on the Run, Imagine, It Don't Come Easy. It dwarfed them all. And I think that the religious, at the time you could get away with a more religious song, and it had that whole hippie feel, the kind of all you need is love thing. But despite the religious tone of it, I mean, George Harrison still had the balls, you know, to release it in true Beatle fashion, so I give him credit for that. Unfortunately, all the good fortune from that single, sales and adulation, was marred by the copyrights, because it infringed on He's So Fine.
My sweet Lord.
So the other thing about All Things Must Pass is George Harrison introduced a new guitar sound, and that's that slide guitar. I call it kind of his gimmicky slide. And I thought it was a bit bubblegummy, and it worked really well for a couple songs. I think he overused it in his career a bit, but I think for this song it worked perfectly. Pure joy. The other song that's the second single is What Is Life? And this is another joyful, glorious song. It packs a lot of power. And this is when Harrison was still offering a little rock and roll in his music. And What Is Life also hit the top 10 at number 10 in the States.
What I feel, I can't say.
Now the next song on here, I'm not, these are not in order of the album, but then I'm just kind of taking what I consider the top songs here. Beware of Darkness for me has always been one of Harrison's best songs. I guess I call it a near masterpiece. I think it's one of the best songs he ever wrote in his solo era, in his solo years. Harrison told Mike Hennessy that Beware of Darkness was his favorite of all his compositions. And Ben Gerson of Rolling Stone wrote that Beware of Darkness was possibly the album's best song. I think I would agree with that. I do like All Things Must Pass a lot, but not as much as Beware of Darkness. It just has so much meaning. It's a beautiful song, well played, not overdone production-wise, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Watch out now, take up.
The other song on here I just mentioned, All Things Must Pass, the title track, the song that was left over from the Beatles' Get Back, Let It Be sessions, the song that was not rejected, but withdrawn by George Harrison himself in the Beatle sessions, and I think he knew it was a really good song. And in the Get Back sessions, one of the things that they were trying to work with him on, because they went over that song over 70 times, and he was looking for, I think, a fully produced song. And I kind of think, this is my own opinion, but I think he was thinking of Within You, Without You, to have a production on that level for this song. So he got his chance here, and it doesn't sound that much different. The arrangement is exactly the same as the Beatles version, with obviously a little more lush orchestration and everything. But he didn't really change it at all, and maybe it didn't need any changing. Another slow song on here that I think is really good is I'd Have You Anytime, which is a Dylan collaboration. And I know that Harrison, he took the Dylan, I think he had a line that Dylan had started and said, hey, I think we've got a song here, and really worked it into something quite beautiful. And I'm a little sorry that they didn't team up more. I would have loved to see those guys do an album together. I think that could have been amazing. Song number 6 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, 6, Isn't It a Pity, which John Harris called a jaw-dropping ballad. I think these are the top 6 songs on the album. Isn't It a Pity is a bit sad. It's, had been written earlier in the Beatles' career, as early as 1966. And it shows George's penchant for doing like kind of downer, sullen songs that are a little darker and moody. But generally, I think it comes off really well in this album. And it has, even though the nature of it is pitiful, it still has a bright, cheery feel to it. I think that's due to the orchestration.
Isn't it a pity?
This next batch of songs showcase another 6 solid songs. Not as good as the first 6 in my opinion, but very good songs, and it leads off with Apple Scruffs.
Like you have no place to go, but there's so much they don't know about apple scrubs. No one around you will carry the blame for you. Let it roll across the floor. You open up your heart, you know what I mean. We've been polluted so long. Forgive me, Lord, please. Those years when I ignored you. Though you sit in another chair, I can feel.
So we heard Run of the Mill, which is a song I believe about Paul McCartney, Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Waiting on You All, which has got a lot of energy, and that's a lot of fun, that song. Hear Me Lord, a very good melody, and he sings it really confidently, and something you don't always hear George do. And that song gets bogged down a little by the length of it, but still a pretty solid song. And then finally, the last track was Let It Down, which I have always liked. I like the Beatles version of it, though it was never completed. Here it gets bogged down a little bit by some heavy production. This next batch of songs, I think, are the weaker tracks of the album, and I consider to be filler.
Why are you still crying? Your pain is now. Babe, I couldn't even find the door. I couldn't even see.
Behind That Locked Door is a song that I think George seems a little bit uncomfortable in country. It may have been a more suitable song for Ringo. Wah Wah is a song I've never really warmed up to, and the production is so heavy on it that it can't save a mediocre song. I Dig Love is, I think, perhaps the worst song on the album, and would have been a good B-side to Paul McCartney's Bip Bop. And If Not For You, not a bad song, but I'm interested in George Harrison's songs that he writes. I'm not really interested in him doing covers, at least at this stage in his career. So that's a song I've always kind of overlooked, although it's fairly well done. And Art of Dying, I consider to be, that would have been suitable for a bad cop-themed TV show. And now we get to the Apple Jam disc. Now, I want to first say that I think one of the problems of some 60s artists is they thought anything they did was profound, and I think drugs may have hampered some of their decision-making here, and I suspect that may have happened on this Apple Jam disc. This whole album, and the jam part of it, does have this party atmosphere, but I mean, most people pretend this isn't even part of the album. I mean, nobody listens to this. They always say, well, I've listened to it once and that's it. I think that's a shame, and we'll talk about why that disc was added a little bit later. But one of the problems of these jams is that they're extremely weak. Even one of the songs, it cuts right in the middle of the song. That's how it starts. It's like a total hack edit job. And this is the great producer, Phil Spector, at the controls, supposedly. So I think it's really amateurish. Now, the one song I think that could have been made into something is Out of the Blue. It has a nice little groove going. It had a little guitar riff that I think he could have made into something, but he didn't. It's Johnny's Birthday, 49 seconds, why bother? A couple mindless blues workouts to fill out the rest of the album. And one of the sides is like 13.5 minutes long. So we're getting like back to the early Capitol releases where they were only sticking 11 songs on and having very short album size. So it's hardly worth the extra buck it was for the whole album package. The only positive thing to come out of this Apple Jam disc appears to be the illusion that was given to all these backlog of songs that George had. It made him seem like it was like quantity over quality. And he simply didn't have as many songs as is reported. And there are 9 songs on here that were written when the Beatles were still active, I would say. And the rest were all new songs. So George had these 9 songs, but it's also fair to say that John and Paul also had songs that weren't recorded in the Beatles. So those are never considered to be rejected. So they had plenty of songs coming out of the Beatles as well. So George is really no different. And I think the backlog of songs was greatly exaggerated, because if you look at his next release, it wasn't until 3 years later that he came up with another solo album. So he pretty much blew his wad with this album here. And when that album did come out, and I'm talking about Living in the Material World, it just simply wasn't as strong a material as that was on All Things Must Pass. One of the things I would like to point out about this album is this triple album status. Most people consider it a double album, but I would say, is it even a double album? Because, as I said earlier, these songs are padded beyond belief. You've got a second version of Isn't It a Pity, which it doesn't even belong on here. I mean, that's really like about 12 minutes of one song. And some of these songs are just super long. They don't have to be 5 and 6 minutes long. So he was padding out this album quite a bit. And it was Phil Spector that prodded George to do a third disc. And why do you think he did that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the producer gets more money with the number of discs that are recorded. That's why he did it. And this third disc, which is completely amateurish, I mean, Spector made out on that. As did George, but I mean, I think he should be called on it. Speaking of Phil Spector, let's talk a little bit about the production here. Now, Spector had been out of work for years, and the Beatles threw him a bone with Let It Be. And as we all know, this wall of sound was created in the early 60s because he was recording acts that were solo artists. They were singers, they didn't have a band, they were just vocalists. So Spector had to create the band. And he did it in some very unique ways, multiplying instrumentalists and doubling and tripling them in these cavernous studios, giving it a very big sound. And you wouldn't think that George Harrison would need this for this album, because he had tons of great musicians on this record. You didn't need a wall of sound. Harrison had his wall of sound. It was called The Musicians. Let's talk about some of these musicians here. He had Gary Wright, Carl Rattle, Ringo Starr, Bobby Keys, Pete Drake, Peter Frampton, Dave Mason, Gary Brooker, Eric Clapton. So why would you need a wall of sound? So I think there was just this hangover. British fans, UK fans seem to value Spector way more than Americans. So the Beatles were, at least John and George, certainly were big fans of Spector. And I think they were enamored with him, and to have him produce them was like a feather in their cap. But as it turned out, Spector was usually too drunk to be effective at all. Harrison essentially produced this himself. So I think what Spector did, his contribution was setting up some of the miking, and I think he pretty much taught George how to do that. And Harrison pretty much kept that through the entire record with a couple exceptions. Spector's drinking certainly didn't help the proceedings, and it got bad enough where he actually fell down because he was drunk and he broke his arm. So that made him unavailable, I guess. And, overall, I think this album with this religious tone, a stripped back sound would have been much more appropriate than this mega church thing that Spector gave this whole album. I just think it was inappropriate. And, in this 1970, maybe it seemed like that was a good direction to go, because you had all these super groups and things coming up, and maybe that was just a thing. But I just didn't think it worked well for these songs. So 30 years later, when the CD was released, Harrison echoed the same thoughts. Let's see what Harrison said. It's been 30 years since All Things Must Pass was recorded, and I still like the songs on the album and believe they can continue to outlive the style in which they were recorded. It was difficult to resist remixing every track. All these years later, I would like to liberate some of the songs from the big production that seemed appropriate at the time, but now seem a bit over the top with all the reverb in the wall of sound. Still, it was an important album for me and a timely vehicle for all the songs I've been writing during the last period with the Beatles. So he's kind of walking it back here, saying, yeah, it sounds dated. And I think retrospectively, all these reviews you just heard, that praising this album, saying it's the best Beatles solo album, I think the production dates it so that it's not maybe the best. I think some of the other Beatles solo stuff is much better produced. Look at Lennon's first solo album, Plastic Ono Band. That also was produced by Phil Spector. But had Harrison taken that approach with a stripped back approach, I think this would be absolute killer, because you would have had the stripped back, you would have been able to get a better feel for the lyrics and the meaning of the lyrics, which is really where the strength of this album is. It's not the production. Now, the players on this album formed the genesis of Derek and the Dominoes, and writer Richie Unterberger mentions that Clapton made far better use of the musicians, using far less players, allowing the individual musicians to play to their strengths, which I think is completely spot on, and would have been great if Harrison would have taken that approach here. Everybody's just buried in a echoey mush, and you know, it just buried everybody. You know, it's like he mic'd everybody way too much. It's like he probably mic'd the janitor mopping the floor too, for God's sakes. You know, so it's really a disappointment for me after all these years to think of what could have been. Let's talk about George's guitar playing. One of the problems I see with Harrison's solo career, and this is just a personal opinion, is that he kind of gave up playing the guitar. And he went through a couple spurts in the 60s where he put it down and was playing the sitar more than the guitar. And I think that was a mistake, given it was 60s rock music. You know, obviously we know how it all turned out, super guitar based. I think that the slide guitar, the sound that he created with this album, I said earlier it was kind of bubblegummy. I don't care for it that much. I don't think it seems like a cheap gimmick. And it seemed like he wanted to come up with some kind of sound of his own, which he did, but it's not a sound, it kind of grates on me after a while. I think he overused it in his solo career. He did refine it later years. I thought it was much better. But I think that he was trying to become the singer-songwriter, and he de-emphasized his guitar playing. And the other thing I would add is that as good of a guitar player as George is, in his solo period, in particular with this style of slide playing, nobody emulates this playing. Guitars do not talk about this. It's not considered that good. And that would be the acid test if people copy it. And I think it just was a little too, like I said, bubblegummy, or a little bit more, a little too light. Now, George Harrison himself, I think, understood that his playing was not up to scratch, and when he did this album, or this re-release, he redid All Things Must Pass. And in the notes he said that he did that, he added a little sitar to the intro, which is actually pretty cool, and he wanted to emphasize its spiritual roots. And Harrison said that he wanted to play a better slide guitar solo. So I think that kind of tells you that I don't want to say he was embarrassed by his playing, but I certainly think he wanted to improve upon it. I think this proves it. One of the problems with this album was the lawsuit against George Harrison for My Sweet Lord. And it tarnished his image, and I think it hurt his confidence a little bit. And strangely enough, all these glowing reviews, nobody said anything in those reviews about that. It's strangely enough. And obviously, once the song became a huge hit, that's when the lawyers came calling. And I won't go into the whole, it's a very long story actually, kind of humorous how he ended up owning the song in the end. But, you know, John Lennon was one that said, well, he should have known better. You know, and some of the people, I think Joey Molland of Badfinger, who was on the sessions, he said, yeah, that sounds kind of like He's So Fine. So it wasn't unknown to some of the players at least, but everybody said, well, you know, maybe you just can get away with it.
He's so fine. I don't know how I'm gonna do it. I really
Now, John Lennon is one to talk because he got lucky. He got away with one of his big hit songs.
So this is Christmas, and what have you done?
Oh, Stubble was a racehorse, and I wish he were mine.
Looking like a rag doll, mama's little girl. Where you going now, flower? Scarf around your head.
Now, that last song was a McCartney song that is very similar to a Humble Pie song called Song for Jenny. So Harrison wasn't the only one caught up in this kind of, lifting songs or being influenced, or should I say, and by influence, I mean ripping off another artist. This happens all the time. Sometimes you can get away with it if you change enough of it. And in this case, this song was such a big hit. I think the money is what made the people go after him. So one of the things I wanted to also bring up here, we hear so much hand-wringing over, oh, should the White Album have been a single disc? And, obviously it should not have been. But nobody says, well, should this triple album have been a single disc? I say it would have been made a even better single album than a double or triple album. And I think that this box format and the 3 discs gave this impression that Harrison had so much more material than he actually had, because, as I said earlier, it took another 3 years to come up with another solo album. And I think he kind of blew his wad on this. And it would have been nice for him to maybe take the best stuff, release a single disc, and he would have had another album to release around the period of the Bangladesh concert. Despite the misgivings I have for this album, I still consider this one of the top Beatles solo albums, if not the best. I always struggled to pick my top one, but this is usually 1, 2, or 3. I don't know where it is right now, but it's a fine album. And I'm just kind of having a little bit of a go at the people that I feel overrated and overlook some of the obvious flaws in this album. And unfortunately, I think that his next 3 albums, he really struggled to come up with anything nearly as good as this. He just had a hard time living up to something so big that the critics really built him up so big he couldn't live up to repeating that, unfortunately. I'd like to announce another thing that I'm going to be doing exclusively for my Patreon supporters at the $5 tier, and that is another album that never was. I'm going to do an album that never was on All Things Must Pass, and it'll be a single disc, except I'm going to do a raffle, and the winning person will get to choose the 12 songs that are going to be on this disc, and they will receive a hard copy of the album that never was. So that's just one of the things I enjoy doing for my supporters. If you join, you can take in some of those things too. So I've got a lot planned for 2023, a lot more bands coming. And with your suggestions, it's going to be a pretty full year. So you're going to want to see it here on Pop Goes the 60s.